They called me just the janitor for 3 years, until a Pentagon official walked into our break room and saluted me as General Rodriguez. The silence that followed would change everything. If you think you know how power reveals itself, stay tuned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Carmen Rodriguez, and I'm about to tell you how respect can be earned in silence and revealed in a single moment that shatters every assumption in the room. It was 7:32 a.m. on a Tuesday morning at Hartwell Defense Systems in Colorado Springs. I was mopping the executive conference room floor when the regional managers filed in for their monthly strategy meeting. They didn't acknowledge me. They never did. I was invisible furniture, part of the building's infrastructure, nothing more than the cleaning lady who happened to speak Spanish to the other janitors. Diane Kellerman, the vice president of operations, stepped around my mop bucket like I was a piece of equipment. "Can we get this finished?" she snapped. Not to me, but about me, as if I couldn't understand English. Behind her, regional director Jake Thornfield chuckled. "Carmen doesn't mind, do you, Carmen? You're used to working around important people." I continued mopping, methodical strokes across the marble floor, saying nothing. They had no idea that I understood every word of their classified discussions, every detail about the defense contracts they fumbled through, every strategic mistake they made that I could solve in my sleep. "Actually," Diane continued, settling into her leather chair, "we need to talk about the cleaning stuff budget. Some of these people are getting expensive." Her eyes flicked toward me dismissively. "Maybe it's time to outsource to a cheaper company. Get rid of the dead weight." The other executives nodded, in agreement. Sarah Pembroke, director of human resources, shuffled through papers. "I'll handle the termination notices. Start with the oldest employees first. They cost the most in benefits." Dead weight? The words hung in the air as I wrung out my mop. These people who struggled to manage a simple defense contract, who'd lost 3 major bids in the past year, who couldn't figure out why their competitor kept outmaneuvering them in every strategic proposal. They called me dead weight? What they didn't know was that every morning before my janitorial shift began, I spent 2 hours in my car reviewing their competitors' tactics, analyzing market patterns, and mentally redesigning their failed approaches. What they didn't know was that I held 17 patents in advanced defense technology. What they didn't know was that the reason their competitor kept winning wasn't superior strategy. It's because they had recruited someone who understood warfare from the ground up. Someone like me. Jake Thornfield leaned back in his chair, coffee cup in hand. "Carmen, when you're done there, can you make sure the trash in my office gets emptied? And maybe bring some of those little cookies from the break room?" He spoke slowly, as if I were a child or mentally impaired. "Of course, Mr. Thornfield," I replied quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. It was the same voice I'd used for 3 years, the meek, accommodating tone that made them comfortable, that made them forget I was even there. As I gathered my cleaning supplies, Diane's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and paled slightly. "Change of plans," she announced to the room. "The Pentagon is sending someone unannounced today, some big shot from the Defense Acquisition Board. They want to discuss our latest proposal." The room tensed immediately. Their latest proposal, a disaster of epic proportions that completely misunderstood modern asymmetric warfare principles. I had watched them fumble through the draft for weeks, wanting to speak up, knowing exactly how to fix their fatal flaws, but remaining silent in my invisible role. "Who's coming?" Sarah asked nervously. "Someone named General Rodriguez. High-level clearance. They'll be here within an hour to review our readiness for the Meridian defense contract." My hand tightened on the mop handle. General Rodriguez? They had no idea that name belonged to me, or rather, had belonged to me before I decided to disappear into plain sight, before I chose to observe rather than lead, before I started cleaning their offices while mentally cataloging every weakness in their operation. "Well," Jake laughed nervously, "at least Carmen will have the place spotless for the general, right, Carmen?" I nodded silently, pushing my cart toward the door. "Yes, Mr. Thornfield, everything will be perfect." As I left the conference room, I could hear them scrambling, panic creeping into their voices as they realized they were about to be evaluated by someone from the Pentagon's inner circle, someone whose expertise would expose every flaw in their amateur approach to defense contracting. They had no idea the general they feared was already in the building. She had been mopping their floors for 3 years. And, in less than an hour, when the Pentagon official arrived and protocol demanded certain recognitions be observed, the invisible woman in the maintenance uniform would become visible in a way that would redefine every power dynamic in that building. I pushed my cart down the hallway, my steps steady and purposeful. After 3 years of being treated like furniture, it was time for the furniture to stand up and remind everyone exactly who they'd been disrespecting. The silence that was about to follow would be worth every ignored greeting, every dismissive glance, every moment they'd made me feel invisible. Some revelations whisper, others salute. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This wasn't the first time they'd erased me. It wasn't even the worst. 3 years ago, I walked through the doors of Hartwell Defense Systems wearing a maintenance uniform instead of military dress blues, and nobody questioned it. Why would they? I was just another middle-aged Latina woman looking for steady work after retiring from some unknown government position. What they didn't know was that my retirement was voluntary, a strategic withdrawal from a world where I'd spent 22 years climbing ranks, leading classified operations, and earning respect through blood, sweat, and brilliance. I had commanded troops in Afghanistan, developed counterterrorism protocols that saved thousands of lives, and advised 3 different presidential administrations on national security. But after 2 decades of breaking barriers and proving myself in a male-dominated military hierarchy, I was exhausted. Exhausted from being the only woman in rooms full of generals, exhausted from having my strategies questioned until they proved successful, then watching men take credit. Exhausted from being called a diversity hire, despite having more combat experience than half the Joint Chiefs combined. So I disappeared, took my pension, changed my address, and decided to observe the defense industry from the ground up. I wanted to see how these private contractors operated when they thought no one important was watching. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined. The pattern started on day 1. During my interview, Human Resources Director Sarah Pembroke looked at my application and frowned. "It says here you have some military experience?" "Yes, ma'am. 22 years of service." "Well," she shuffled papers dismissively, "that's nice, but janitorial work is very different from whatever you did in the military. We'll start you on probation to make sure you can handle the responsibility." Responsibility? Of emptying trash cans and mopping floors? After I'd been responsible for operations that determined the fate of nations? The condescension only got worse. Within my first week, Jake Thornfield started leaving me post-it notes with instructions on how to clean toilets properly. "Carmen, make sure you scrub under the rim. I know it's gross, but that's what we pay you for." He'd drawn a little smiley face at the bottom, as if his patronizing tone was somehow friendly. By month 2, they'd established a routine of talking about me like I wasn't there. During coffee breaks, I'd overhear conversations that made my blood boil. "Carmen's sweet, but you can tell she's never worked in a professional environment before. Her English is pretty good for someone like her." I tried to explain the filing system to her 3 times. I think there might be a language barrier. Someone like her, a language barrier. I spoke 4 languages fluently and had briefed NATO commanders in 3 of them. But because I chose to speak quietly and keep my head down, they assumed I was intellectually limited.
The most infuriating part wasn't their individual acts of disrespect, it was their complete blindness to their own incompetence. Every day, I watched them stumble through defense contracts like amateur hour. I listened to Diane Kellerman butcher military terminology in client calls. I saw Jake Thornfield present strategic analyses that a first-year West Point cadet would laugh at. During one particularly painful quarterly meeting, I watched Diane present a revolutionary new approach to base security that was actually a standard protocol I'd implemented at 3 different military installations 5 years earlier. She got a standing ovation from the board. Meanwhile, I was in the corner emptying waste baskets, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. The irony reached peak absurdity during my 18th month when Hartwell lost the Patterson Air Force Base contract, a $47 million deal they'd been pursuing for 6 months. I was cleaning Diane's office when she got the call informing her they'd lost to Meridian Defense Solutions. "I don't understand," she said into the phone, pacing frantically. "Our proposal was comprehensive. We covered every angle." From my position reorganizing her bookshelf, I could have told her exactly why they lost. Their comprehensive proposal had failed to account for modern cyber warfare vulnerabilities, ignored recent changes in DoD procurement protocols, and completely misunderstood the base's strategic positioning requirements. Meridian won because they understood something Hartwell didn't. Military contracts aren't just about equipment and logistics. They're about understanding warfare itself. But I said nothing. I just continued dusting her awards. Awards for innovative leadership in an industry she barely understood. The breaking point came during my second year when they promoted Trevor Walsh, a 28-year-old MBA with 0 military experience, to senior defense analyst. His first day, he walked into the break room where I was restocking paper towels and announced to the other janitors, "Make sure you guys keep the real offices clean. The important people work in there." The important people. This kid who couldn't tell the difference between a strategic objective and a tactical maneuver was calling himself important while dismissing me as irrelevant. What really stung was watching Trevor present his analysis of Middle Eastern conflict zones the following month. I recognized it immediately. It was a direct copy of a briefing I'd given to the Pentagon 3 years earlier, slightly reworded and stripped of all its nuanced understanding. He'd found it in some declassified database and presented it as original research.
As he spoke confidently about regions where I'd actually served, using terminology he clearly didn't understand, I realized something important. These people weren't just disrespecting me personally, they were disrespecting the entire military community by pretending to understand warfare while remaining willfully ignorant of its realities. By year 3, the pattern was fully established. I was the invisible woman who cleaned around their conversations about defense strategy, who emptied trash bins filled with their failed proposals, who restocked supplies while they made decisions that affected national security from a position of breathtaking incompetence. They saw a middle-aged cleaning lady who was grateful for the job. I saw a defense contractor that was failing upward, while real military professionals were fighting and dying based on the intelligence and strategies that companies like Hartwell were supposed to support. Every morning, I clocked in at 6 a.m., put on my maintenance uniform, and watched people who had never served a day in uniform make decisions about military affairs. Every evening, I clocked out and went home to an apartment where my Medal of Honor sat in a box in the closet, invisible, like the woman who'd earned it. For 3 years, I'd been conducting the most extensive undercover operation of my career, not for national security, but from my own understanding of how broken the system had become. Today, that operation was about to reach its conclusion. And unlike my previous missions, this one was about to be
very, very public. What they didn't know would have terrified them. As I wheeled my cleaning cart down the sterile hallway toward the executive wing, my mind wasn't on the upcoming Pentagon visit or the chaos brewing in the conference room. Instead, I was remembering a classified briefing from 18 months ago, one that would explain exactly why a Pentagon official was making an unannounced visit to Hartwell Defense Systems today. Operation Nightfall, a joint task force initiative I'd helped design during my final year of active duty. The operation required identifying private defense contractors who could handle next-generation asymmetric warfare protocols. The Pentagon had been quietly evaluating companies across the country, testing their readiness for contracts that would reshape modern military strategy. Hartwell Defense Systems was on the list, and they were failing spectacularly. What made it worse was that I knew exactly why they were failing, and I'd been watching it happen in real time for 3 years. Every bungled proposal, every missed opportunity, every strategic miscalculation. I'd witnessed it all while emptying their trash and cleaning their whiteboards. The irony was suffocating. The very woman they dismissed as intellectually inferior had designed the evaluation criteria they were failing to meet. The cleaning lady they spoke over had authored the strategic frameworks they couldn't comprehend. The immigrant worker they patronized had more security clearance in her personnel file than their entire executive team combined. But the deepest irony was personal, and it cut straight to my core. General Carmen Rodriguez, my military identity, wasn't just some random Pentagon official coming to evaluate Hartwell. I was the primary architect of the Meridian defense contract they'd lost 6 months ago. I had designed those specifications based on real-world combat experience, anticipating the exact type of innovative thinking that Hartwell consistently failed to demonstrate. When Diane Kellerman had called their lost proposal comprehensive, she had no idea she was talking to the person who'd written the evaluation rubric that exposed every gap in their understanding. When Jake Thornfield complained about their competitors' unfair advantages, he didn't realize he was speaking to someone who knew exactly why Meridian Defense Solutions kept winning. They hired actual veterans who understood warfare, not MBA graduates who treated military strategy like a business case study. The most painful irony of all was sitting in Diane's office right now, filed away in a locked cabinet that I'd dusted countless times. My security clearance documentation, my real personnel file, the paperwork that would have revealed my identity to anyone who bothered to run a proper background check. But they never did. Why would they? I was just the cleaning staff. Instead, they'd processed my employment using only my basic Social Security information and a cursory criminal background check. They'd never looked deeper, never wondered why a woman with a graduate degree from the Naval War College was applying for janitorial work, never questioned why someone with my qualifications would accept a position so far below her capabilities. Their assumption was simple. Immigrants and working-class women don't have classified military backgrounds. People who mop floors don't advise presidents on national security. Cleaning ladies don't hold patents on advanced weapon systems. But I did. All of it. In my small apartment 15 minutes from Hartwell, I kept a secure safe that contained documents these executives would kill to possess, combat deployment records from 3 different theaters of operation, commendation letters from 4-star generals, classified briefing notes from Pentagon strategy sessions, and most importantly, the original specifications for next-generation defense contracts that companies like Hartwell were desperately trying to understand. I literally wrote the playbook they were failing to read. 3 months ago, I watched Trevor Walsh present his innovative approach to drone warfare logistics, an innovative approach that was actually a simplified version of protocols I'd developed during my deployment in Syria. He got a $50,000 bonus for that presentation. Meanwhile, I got a written warning for being 3 minutes late to work because my bus had broken down. 2 weeks after that, Sarah Pembroke lectured me about professional communication standards because I asked a clarifying question about which floors needed deep cleaning. She spoke to me like I was a child learning basic workplace etiquette, the same woman who routinely sent emails to military personnel that violated basic protocol and demonstrated complete ignorance of military hierarchy.
The absurdity reached peak levels when Diane started bringing me into meetings as additional cleaning support during important client calls. She wanted the offices to look perfect for video conferences, so I'd be dusting bookshelves and organizing papers while she fumbled through presentations to actual military officials. During one particularly memorable call with Colonel Janet Martinez from Fort Carson, I'd listened to Diane completely misrepresent Hartwell's capabilities while I stood 3 feet away, invisible, knowing that Colonel Martinez and I had served together in Afghanistan. We'd planned joint operations, shared intel, and developed mutual respect over 6 months of deployment. But Colonel Martinez didn't recognize me. How could she? The last time she'd seen me, I was wearing combat fatigues and a general's insignia, not a maintenance uniform and rubber gloves. The transformation was so complete that my own former colleagues couldn't see through it. That was when I realized the true power of invisibility, not just being overlooked, but being so thoroughly dismissed that people couldn't perceive reality even when it was standing right in front of them. Over the past 3 years, I'd accumulated intelligence on Hartwell Defense Systems that would have taken the Pentagon months to gather through official channels. I knew every weakness in their security protocols, every gap in their strategic thinking, every personality conflict among their leadership team. I'd observed their decision-making processes up close, cataloged their failures, and documented their incompetence with the precision of a trained intelligence officer. Because that's exactly what I was. While they were treating me like furniture, I was conducting the most thorough assessment of their organization that had ever been performed. Every conversation I'd overheard, every document I'd seen while cleaning, every strategic discussion I'd witnessed, it had all been processed through the analytic framework of a general who understood warfare at the highest levels. I knew things about Hartwell that their own board of directors didn't know. I understood their weaknesses better than their own consultants. I had access to information that their competitors would pay millions to obtain. And in exactly 37 minutes, when the Pentagon official arrived and military protocol demanded that certain recognitions be observed, all of that intelligence would become relevant in ways that would fundamentally alter every relationship in this building. Because the Pentagon wasn't sending General Rodriguez to evaluate Hartwell Defense Systems. General Rodriguez was already here. She'd been taking notes for 3 years, and she was about to present her findings in person. The cleaning lady was about to become the auditor, the observer was about to become the authority, and the invisible woman was about to become the most visible person in the room. Some secrets hide in plain sight. Others hide behind mop buckets and maintenance uniforms, gathering intelligence while the world assumes they're just there to clean up other people's mess. But every intelligence operation eventually reaches its conclusion. Today was my debrief. The Pentagon staff car pulled into Hartwell's parking lot at exactly 9:47 a.m. I watched from the third-floor window as a Navy officer in dress blues stepped out, followed by 2 Marine escorts. Through the glass, I could see Diane Kellerman rushing toward the lobby, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor, Jake Thornfield close behind, both of them trying to look composed while panic radiated from every gesture. This was it, the moment 3 years of careful observation would transform into decisive action. But not in the way anyone expected. I pulled out my personal cell phone, not the basic flip phone Hartwell knew about, but my encrypted military device that I'd kept active throughout my entire retirement. The screen showed 17 missed calls from Pentagon officials, all wondering why General Rodriguez wasn't responding to their coordination attempts for today's evaluation. They had no idea that General Rodriguez had been inside the building for 3 years, taking the most comprehensive assessment of Hartwell Defense Systems that had ever been conducted. I scrolled through my contacts and found the number I needed. Commander Beth Morrison, my former aide-de-camp, who now worked in Pentagon procurement oversight.
Beth had been coordinating today's evaluation visit, assuming I would arrive separately from the official delegation. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered. Commander Morrison. Beth, it's Carmen. General, where are you? The evaluation team arrived at Hartwell 10 minutes ago, and you were supposed to meet them there. Are you running late? I smiled, watching through the window as Diane frantically gestured to the security guard about parking arrangements. I'm not running late, Beth. I'm already here. I've been here for 3 years. Silence. Then, ma'am, I don't understand. I need you to do something for me. Contact the evaluation team downstairs and tell them that General Rodriguez is conducting her assessment from an alternative position. Tell them to request a complete staff assembly in Conference Room A at 10:15 a.m. Full executive team, all department heads, and all support staff. Everyone. Ma'am, can you clarify this a little? Beth, trust me. This is the most important evaluation the Pentagon has ever conducted at a private contractor. I need everyone in that room, and I need the lead evaluator to follow my exact instructions. Can you make that happen? Yes, ma'am, but General, I'll explain everything in about 20 minutes. Just make sure they understand this comes directly from General Rodriguez, and that my authority supersedes any company protocols they might want to invoke. I hung up and immediately made my second call, this one to my contact at Meridian Defense Solutions, the company that had been consistently outbidding Hartwell. Within 5 minutes, I'd arranged for their senior military liaison to be available for a conference call at 10:30 a.m.
The third call went to Colonel Martinez at Fort Carson, the same officer who'd been on video calls with Diane, the same colleague who hadn't recognized me while I dusted bookshelves into background. Colonel Martinez? This is General Rodriguez. Carmen, how are you? I heard you were doing some consulting work with private contractors these days. Something like that. Janet, I need you to be available for a video conference in 30 minutes. Pentagon procurement oversight. And Janet, you're going to want to be sitting down for this one. My final call was the most important one. I dialed the direct line to General Patricia Hawkins, my former commanding officer and current head of the Defense Acquisition Board. Patricia, it's Carmen. I'm about to conduct the Hartwell evaluation. Finally, how does it look? The preliminary reports haven't been encouraging. Patricia, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me completely. For the past 3 years, I've been conducting the most comprehensive undercover assessment of a defense contractor in Pentagon history. I've been working inside Hartwell Defense Systems as a janitor. The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 10 seconds. Carmen, did you just say you've been working as a janitor? For 3 years. Patricia, these people are not just unqualified for military contracts, they're dangerously incompetent. I have documentation that will revolutionize how the Pentagon approaches contractor evaluation. But right now, I need you to conference into a call at 10:15. You're going to witness something that's never been done before. What exactly are you planning? I'm going to reveal my identity to a room full of people who have been treating me like invisible furniture for 3 years, and then I'm going to present my findings directly to them and to Pentagon oversight simultaneously. General Hawkins laughed, not with humor, but with the kind of amazement that comes from recognizing a brilliant tactical maneuver. Carmen, you realize this is either the most innovative intelligence operation in Pentagon history or a complete career-ending disaster. Patricia, after 3 years of watching these people mishandle national security contracts while I emptied their trash cans, I can promise you it's not a disaster, it's justice. At 10:08 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Beth Morrison. Staff assembly confirmed. Everyone's gathering now. Lead evaluator has been briefed to follow your instructions. Whatever you're doing, the Pentagon is watching. I walked to the women's restroom on the 3rd floor, the same restroom where I'd changed into my maintenance uniform every morning for 3 years. But today, I wasn't putting it on, I was taking it off. From my oversized cleaning supply bag, I pulled out items that no one at Hartwell had ever seen me carry. A pressed military dress uniform, complete with general's insignia, ribbons, and decorations. My hair, which I had kept in a simple ponytail for 3 years, was carefully arranged into regulation military style. The transformation took exactly 7 minutes. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see Carmen the cleaning lady anymore. I saw General Rodriguez, decorated combat veteran, Pentagon advisor, and the woman who was about to deliver the most devastating performance evaluation in corporate history. At 10:14 a.m., I walked toward conference room A, passing several employees in the hallway. None of them recognized me. The woman in the general's uniform was so far outside their expectation of who I could be that their brains simply couldn't process the connection. Outside the conference room, I could hear Diane's voice through the door, stressed and confused. I don't understand why the Pentagon official isn't here yet. The evaluation team said General Rodriguez was already in the building, but that's impossible. We would have known if a general was here. Jake's voice responded, "Maybe they made a mistake. Maybe she's running late." I took a deep breath, straightened my uniform, and knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps, the kind of authoritative knock that announces the arrival of someone who expects immediate attention. "Come in," Diane called. I opened the door and stepped into the room where I mopped floors countless times, where I'd been ignored and dismissed and treated like furniture. Every person in that room, 37 employees, from executives to support staff, turned to look at the woman in the general's uniform. The silence was immediate and absolute. I could see the confusion rippling across their faces as their minds struggled to process what they were seeing. Some of them recognized something familiar but couldn't place it. Others stared blankly, having no context for understanding how this uniformed military officer could have appeared in their corporate conference room. But slowly, like recognition dawning through fog, a few of them began to understand. Diane's face went white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jake Tornfield's coffee cup slipped from his hand, hitting the table with a ceramic crack that echoed through the silent room. Sarah Pembroke's eyes went wide, and she whispered one word that cut through the stillness like a blade. "Carmen." I stood at attention in the doorway, every inch the general I'd always been, finally visible to people who had convinced themselves I was invisible. "Good morning," I said, my voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of military command. "I'm General Carmen Rodriguez, United States Army, assigned to Pentagon procurement oversight and defense contractor evaluation."
The silence deepened, becoming something physical, something that pressed against the walls and made breathing difficult. For the past 3 years, I've been conducting an undercover assessment of this organization's fitness for military contracts. Today, I'm here to present my findings. That's when the room exploded. The explosion wasn't loud. It was the kind of implosion that happens when an entire room's understanding of reality collapses simultaneously. Diane Kellerman shot to her feet so quickly her chair toppled backward, the crash echoing through the conference room like a gunshot. Her face had gone from white to gray, and her hands were visibly shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. This can't be," she stammered, her usual corporate confidence completely evaporated. "You're Carmen. You clean our offices. You empty our trash. You don't speak up in meetings. You can't be a general," I finished, calmly, stepping fully into the room. "I assure you, Miss Kellerman, I am exactly who I say I am, and I've been observing your operations with great interest." Jake Thornfield was frantically scrolling through his phone, his breathing rapid and shallow. "This is impossible," he muttered. "We would have known. Background checks, security clearances. There's no way a general could have been working here without us knowing." Behind me, the Pentagon evaluation team entered the room, their expressions professional but clearly enjoying the chaos unfolding before them. The lead evaluator, Colonel Marcus Webb, positioned himself near the wall with his tablet ready, preparing to document what was about to become legendary in Pentagon circles. Sarah Pembroke was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "The cleaning staff background checks. We only did basic criminal and credit checks. Military service isn't something we typically verify for janitorial positions." "Because you assumed," I said, my voice cutting through the room with military precision, "that someone with my qualifications would never take such a position. You assumed that intelligence and education and military expertise couldn't exist in the body of a middle-aged Latina woman pushing a mop bucket." Trevor Walsh, the young MBA who'd called the cleaning staff unimportant people, was hyperventilating. "The briefings, the strategy presentations I gave, you were there. You heard everything. You heard classified. Nothing you discussed was classified, Mr. Walsh. In fact, most of your innovative approaches were simplified versions of protocols I developed during my active duty service. The room erupted in panicked whispers. Employees were pulling out phones, frantically texting, making calls. Some were staring at me in absolute shock. Others were looking around the room as if searching for an exit from a nightmare. Diane's phone rang and she answered it with trembling fingers. I could hear the voice on the other end, sharp, authoritative, clearly from corporate headquarters. Her face went even paler as she listened. "Yes, sir. Yes, she's here. No, sir, we had no idea. No, sir, we did not know we had a Pentagon general working as... Yes, sir, I understand this is a catastrophic security breach." She hung up and looked at me with the expression of someone watching their career disintegrate in real time. That was the CEO. Corporate security is conducting an emergency review of our entire hiring and background check process. There's going to be a full investigation. "I'm sure there will be," I replied calmly. "Though I suspect the investigation will reveal that your processes aren't the only thing that needs reviewing." My phone buzzed with a text from Commander Morrison. "Pentagon brass is watching a live feed. General Hawkins wants to know if you're ready for the conference call." I looked around the room at 37 faces that had ignored me, dismissed me, and patronized me for 3 years. Now every single one of them was focused on me with laser intensity, hanging on every word I said. I'll be conducting a conference call with Pentagon oversight in 5 minutes. During that call, I'll be presenting my comprehensive assessment of Hartwell Defense Systems' fitness for military contracts. I recommend that senior staff remain present for that discussion. Jake Thornfield stood up on unsteady legs. "General Rodriguez, ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. If we had known who you were, we would have..." "You would have what, Mr. Thornfield?" I asked, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Treated me with respect? Valued my input? Actually listened when I tried to contribute? Or would you have simply found more sophisticated ways to marginalize me?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sarah Pembroke was frantically typing on her laptop. "I'm pulling your employment file right now," she said, her voice cracking with stress. "There has to be some record, some indication. You'll find exactly what you put there, Miss Pembroke. Basic information, emergency contact, social security verification. Everything you thought you needed to hire someone you considered intellectually inferior." The younger employees in the room were staring at me like I was an alien species. Rachel Montgomery, a junior analyst who'd once asked me to clean up coffee she'd spilled while making a condescending joke about the help, looked like she was going to be sick. The conversations, all the times we talked about sensitive projects while you were cleaning. You heard everything. Every word. Including your assessment last month that the Pentagon's new asymmetric warfare protocols were probably just military bureaucracy that private industry could streamline. For the record, Miss Montgomery, I helped write those protocols based on actual combat experience.
The panic in the room was becoming palpable. Diane was making another phone call, this one to what sounded like the company's legal department. Jake was pacing near the windows, muttering under his breath about security breaches and career suicide. Several junior employees were openly crying. But the most satisfying reaction came from Trevor Walsh, who had gone completely silent and was staring at me with the dawning realization that every innovative presentation he'd given had been observed by the person who'd actually created the strategies he'd been plagiarizing. "The Syria deployment analysis," he said slowly, his voice barely audible. "The drone logistics optimization. The counter-terrorism protocols. You knew they weren't original." "I knew they were simplified versions of my own work, Mr. Walsh. I also knew that you didn't understand the underlying principles well enough to implement them effectively, which is why all of your recommendations were strategically flawed." My phone rang. "General Hawkins, right on schedule." "Excuse me," I said to the room. "I need to take this call from the Pentagon." I answered in full view of everyone, my voice shifting into the tone I'd used for military briefings with presidential cabinet members. "General Rodriguez speaking? Yes, ma'am. I'm ready to begin the evaluation conference. All Hartwell senior staff are present, along with the Pentagon evaluation team."
Through the phone speaker, loud enough for the room to hear, came General Hawkins' voice. Carmen, I have to say, this is the most unconventional contractor assessment in Pentagon history. Are you prepared to present your findings? Fully prepared, ma'am. I have 3 years of comprehensive observational data on Hartwell Defense Systems' operational capabilities, strategic understanding, and organizational competence. Outstanding. Colonel Martinez from Fort Carson is standing by, as is the Meridian Defense Solution liaison. They're very interested in your assessment. Diane's face went from gray to green at the mention of their primary competitor. Jake actually stumbled and had to grab a chair for support. Before we begin the formal evaluation, I continued, still speaking to General Hawkins but making sure my voice carried throughout the room, I should note that Hartwell's executive team appears to be experiencing some shock at discovering my identity. It seems they've spent 3 years assuming that their cleaning staff couldn't possibly possess relevant military expertise. General Hawkins' laughter came through the speaker clearly. Well, Carmen, I suppose they're about to get a very expensive education in the dangers of making assumptions about people's capabilities. I looked around the room one more time, taking in every face that had dismissed me, every expression that was now focused on me with desperate attention. Indeed they are, ma'am. Shall we begin? The silence that followed was the sound of 37 people realizing that their careers were about to be evaluated by someone they'd spent 3 years treating like furniture. And that evaluation was about to be conducted live, with Pentagon oversight and their primary competitor listening in. The cleaning lady was about to clean house. The Pentagon conference call hadn't even begun when the desperate manipulation attempts started. Diane held up her hand, interrupting my conversation with General Hawkins. General Rodriguez, before we proceed, could we possibly have a private moment? I think there may have been some miscommunications that we could clear up quickly. I looked at her with the same expression I'd used when Taliban negotiators tried to stall during peace talks in Afghanistan. Miss Kellerman, this is a formal Pentagon evaluation. There are no private moments. But Diane wasn't backing down. 3 years of corporate maneuvering had trained her to believe that any situation could be managed with the right combination of authority and charm. She clearly hadn't grasped that those tools were useless against someone who'd spent 2 decades in environments where lives depended on cutting through exactly this kind of manipulation. Of course, she said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. You see, General, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about how we operate here at Hartwell Defense Systems. Jake stepped forward, joining what was clearly going to be a coordinated damage control effort. Absolutely. General Rodriguez, I think what Diane is trying to say is that if we had known about your incredible qualifications, we would have immediately moved you into a strategic advisory position. This is obviously a massive oversight on our part, but it's one we can correct immediately. I set my phone on speaker mode so the Pentagon could hear every word of what was about to unfold. Mr. Thornfield, I said calmly, are you suggesting that my qualifications determine how I should be treated as a human being? That respect is something that should only be shown to people whose credentials you're aware of? No, that's not what I meant at all, he backpedaled frantically. What I'm saying is that we have tremendous respect for the military, and if we had known you were a general, you would have what? Stopped leaving me condescending post-it notes about how to clean toilets? Stopped talking about me like I was intellectually disabled? Stopped discussing classified information in front of me because you assumed I was too stupid to understand it? Sarah Pembroke jumped into the conversation, her HR training kicking in as she attempted crisis management. General Rodriguez, I want to personally apologize for any miscommunications or cultural misunderstandings that may have occurred. Hartwell Defense Systems has always prided itself on being an inclusive workplace that values diversity. Through the phone speaker, I could hear General Hawkins snort with laughter.
Miss Pembroke, I replied, are you classifying 3 years of systematic disrespect as cultural misunderstandings? Because I'm curious which culture you think finds it appropriate to speak slowly to employees because you assume they have language barriers.
Or which diversity training program taught you that it's acceptable to discuss terminating expensive older employees while they're standing 3 feet away from you? Her face flushed red. You never intended for me to understand English well enough to know you were discussing firing me? Or you'd never intended for me to have enough intelligence to remember the conversations you had about my supposed incompetence? Trevor Walsh, who had been silent since realizing the scope of his plagiarism, suddenly spoke up with the desperation of someone watching their career circle the drain. General, ma'am, I want to personally apologize for any confusion about my research presentations. If I inadvertently referenced work that was similar to yours, it was completely unintentional. I had no idea that— Mr. Walsh, are you telling a Pentagon general that you inadvertently copied classified military protocols that you found in declassified databases and presented them as your own original research? The color drained from his face. Through the phone, I could hear General Hawkins taking notes. Because that's not inadvertent similarity, Mr. Walsh. That's either academic plagiarism or security protocol violation, depending on how the Pentagon chooses to classify it. Trevor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I can explain. The research was available through legitimate channels. Research that I authored, Mr. Walsh. Research based on combat operations that you've never served in, addressing strategic challenges that you've never faced, using terminology that you clearly don't understand. And you presented it to military personnel as your own work, while the actual author was emptying trash cans in the corner. Diane tried to regain control of the situation, her voice taking on the commanding tone she usually used with subordinates. General Rodriguez, I think we're getting off track here. The important thing is that we recognize your incredible value to this organization. We want to make this right. We're prepared to offer you a senior consultant position immediately, with full strategic authority and compensation commensurate with your experience. I stared at her for a long moment, the same stare I'd used with insurgent leaders who thought they could buy their way out of consequences. Miss Kellerman, are you attempting to bribe a Pentagon official during a formal evaluation? Her face went white. No, that's not what I meant. I was simply saying that we want to correct our mistake. Your mistake was assuming that your cleaning staff was beneath your notice. Your mistake was believing that respect should be conditional on credentials. Your mistake was treating another human being like furniture for 3 years. Jake was sweating now, his shirt collar darkening with perspiration. General, please, we understand that we made errors of judgment, but surely we can work something out here. Hartwell has been a reliable Pentagon contractor for 15 years. We've never had any serious security incidents or performance issues. Through the phone speaker came Colonel Martinez's voice. Actually, Mr. Thornfield, you've lost 4 major contracts in the past 18 months due to strategic inadequacies in your proposals, and your security protocols are about to be thoroughly reviewed given this situation. The room went silent as they realized that not only was the Pentagon listening to every word, but they were also being evaluated by military officers who were already aware of Hartwell's performance problems. Sarah made one last desperate attempt at damage control. General Rodriguez, from a human resources perspective, I want you to know that we're committed to implementing comprehensive sensitivity training and cultural awareness programs. We can bring in consultants who specialize in workplace inclusion and— Miss Pembroke, I cut her off. You want to bring in consultants to teach your executives not to treat their employees like subhuman? You need professional training to learn that intelligence and capability aren't determined by job titles or accents? That's not what Because here's what your consultants will tell you. The problem isn't that you need sensitivity training. The problem is that you fundamentally don't see certain people as fully human. And that's not a training issue. That's a character issue. Diane made one final attempt, her voice cracking with desperation. General, we're willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. Name your terms. Full executive position, equity stake in the company, whatever you think is fair. We just need to find a way forward that works for everyone. I looked around the room at 37 faces that had ignored me for 3 years and were now hanging on my every word with desperate intensity. Miss Kellerman, I said quietly, you want to know what would be fair?
3 years ago, if you had treated me with basic human dignity, if you had listened when I tried to contribute ideas during meetings, if you had recognized that competence and intelligence exist in people regardless of their job titles or backgrounds. We can do that now, she said quickly. Moving forward, I interrupted. I won't be here because I'm not your employee, Miss Kellerman. I'm a Pentagon general conducting an evaluation of your organization's fitness for military contracts. The silence that followed was deafening.
And based on 3 years of direct observation, I continued, I'm about to recommend that Hartwell Defense Systems be removed from all Pentagon contractor eligibility lists. That's when the room exploded into chaos. Shouting voices, desperate protests, chairs scraping against the floor as people jumped to their feet. Through it all, my phone continued broadcasting the sound of their panic directly to Pentagon oversight and their primary competitor. I stood calmly in the center of the storm, watching 3 years of dismissive behavior transform into frantic desperation. The invisible woman had become the most powerful person in the room, and she was just getting started. I raised my hand, and the chaos stopped instantly. 37 people, who had never given me that kind of immediate attention, were now responding to my authority with military precision. The transformation was startling. These same executives who had talked over me, around me, and about me for 3 years were now silent at a simple gesture. Before we proceed with the formal evaluation, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat zones, I want to establish the new parameters for this conversation. I moved to the head of the conference table, the same table where I'd been invisible while serving coffee and cleaning around their important discussions. Now I stood where Diane usually held court, and she automatically stepped aside, her corporate authority evaporating in the presence of real leadership. First, I announced, this is no longer a business meeting. This is a military evaluation being conducted under Pentagon authority. That means military protocol supersedes your corporate chain of command. I am the ranking officer in this room, and my authority is absolute. Jake started to speak, but I held up a finger, and he stopped mid-syllable. Second, I continued, any attempt to contact corporate headquarters, legal departments, or external consultants during this evaluation will be considered interference with a Pentagon investigation. All phones will be placed on the table, face down, until we conclude. The room erupted in protests. You can't confiscate our phones. This is still private property. We have rights as American citizens. I let them voice their objections for exactly 30 seconds, then spoke over them with the voice I'd used to command attention in war zones. You are correct that you have rights as American citizens. You have the right to refuse cooperation with this Pentagon evaluation. You also have the right to explain to your board of directors, your shareholders, and your families why you chose to obstruct a military investigation that will determine whether Hartwell Defense Systems continues to exist as a viable business. The protests stopped immediately. One by one, phones were placed on the table. Third, I said, walking slowly around the room like I was reviewing troops, for the remainder of this evaluation, you will address me as General Rodriguez or ma'am, not Carmen, not by any diminutive or familiar name you've used for the past 3 years. The woman you called by her first name while treating her like hired help no longer exists in this room. Sarah raised her hand tentatively. General Rodriguez, ma'am, what exactly are the terms of this evaluation? What are you looking for from us? Excellent question, Miss Pembroke. I'm looking for honesty, complete, unvarnished honesty about how Hartwell Defense Systems operates, how decisions are made, and how employees are valued. I pulled out a leather portfolio that none of them had ever seen before, my official Pentagon evaluation materials. For 3 years, I've been documenting every meeting, every decision, every conversation that revealed how this organization functions. But now I want to hear it directly from you. Diane cleared her throat nervously.
General Rodriguez, ma'am, what specifically would you like to know? Let's start with personnel management, Ms. Kellerman. How do you evaluate employee potential? How do you identify talent that might be underutilized? The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Well, she began carefully, we have regular performance reviews, and we encourage employees to communicate their career goals through proper channels. I see. And did you ever ask your cleaning staff about their career goals? Did you ever conduct performance reviews with maintenance personnel to identify potential leadership capabilities? Silence. Let me rephrase the question, I said, opening my portfolio and pulling out a thick file. In 3 years of employment reviews, how many times did any member of senior staff have a substantive conversation with me about my background, my capabilities, or my potential contributions to strategic initiatives? More silence. The answer is zero. Zero conversations, zero inquiries, zero interest in whether the woman emptying your trash cans might have insights that could improve your military contract performance. Trevor Walsh raised his hand like a student asking permission to speak. General Rodriguez, ma'am, in our defense, it's not standard practice to conduct strategic interviews with janitorial staff. I smiled, the kind of smile that had made enemy commanders nervous during peace negotiations. Mr. Walsh, let me share something interesting with you. At Meridian Defense Solutions, your primary competitor, they have a policy of conducting quarterly hidden talent reviews with all employees, regardless of position. They've discovered that some of their most valuable strategic insights come from employees in support roles who have military backgrounds, advanced degrees, or specialized expertise that wasn't captured in their initial job applications.
In fact, I continued, Meridian has identified 17 former military officers, 12 veterans with advanced degrees, and 6 employees with security clearances working in various support capacities. They regularly promote from within, and their win rate on Pentagon contracts reflects the value of that approach. I could see the implications hitting them like physical blows. But here's the most interesting part, I said, moving to the whiteboard where Diane usually outlined her strategic initiatives. Meridian specifically targets companies like Hartwell that undervalue their workforce. They actively recruit employees who are working below their potential at competitors' firms. Jake's voice came out as a croak. Are you saying they've been recruiting our people? I'm saying they understand something that Hartwell doesn't. Talent exists at every level of an organization, and the companies that recognize that talent first gain a competitive advantage. I began writing on the whiteboard. Names, dates, contract values. Information that I'd gathered during 3 years of observation. Here are the contracts you've lost to Meridian in the past 2 years, I said, filling the board with data. Patterson Air Force Base, $67 million. Lost because your proposal ignored cyber warfare vulnerabilities. Trevor's hands were shaking. That was his proposal. Fort Bendix Modernization Contract, $43 million. Lost because your strategic assessment misunderstood operational requirements. Diane's proposal. Mountain View Defense Initiative, $89 million. Lost because your team demonstrated fundamental ignorance of asymmetric warfare principles. Jake's proposal. I turned back to face the room. 3 contracts, $200 million in lost revenue, all due to strategic inadequacies that I could have identified and corrected if anyone in this room had ever asked for my input. The silence was so complete I could hear the air conditioning cycling. So, here are my new terms, I announced, capping the marker and setting it down with deliberate precision. From this moment forward, this evaluation will proceed with complete transparency. No corporate doublespeak, no damage control, no attempts to minimize or explain away 3 years of organizational dysfunction. I moved back to the head of the table. You will answer every question I ask with absolute honesty. You will provide any documentation I request immediately, and you will acknowledge that your treatment of employees, all employees, reflect fundamental flaws in your organizational culture that go far beyond simple miscommunications. Sarah raised her hand again. General Rodriguez, ma'am,
What happens if we comply with these terms? What are the possible outcomes of this evaluation? I looked at her with the expression I used when explaining surrender terms to enemy commanders. Ms. Pembroke, that depends entirely on how honest you're willing to be about how badly you failed at every level of organizational leadership. I opened my phone and activated the conference call with Pentagon oversight. General Hawkins, we're ready to begin the formal evaluation. Colonel Martinez and the Meridian Liaison are standing by. Confirmed, Carmen. All parties are present. Begin when ready. I looked around the room one final time, taking in 37 faces that finally understood they were completely at my mercy. The evaluation of Hartwell Defense Systems begins now, and it will conclude when I determine that I have enough evidence to make my recommendation to Pentagon procurement oversight. I sat down in Diane's chair, the chair at the head of the table where real authority belonged. Let's start with a simple question. How many of you can define asymmetric warfare? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how this evaluation was going to end. The question about asymmetric warfare hung in the air for 47 seconds of absolute silence. Finally, Trevor Walsh raised his hand with the hesitant gesture of a student who wasn't sure he knew the answer. General Rodriguez, ma'am, asymmetric warfare refers to conflict between opponents with significantly different military capabilities, where the weaker force uses unconventional tactics to exploit the stronger force's vulnerabilities. I nodded slowly. A textbook definition, Mr. Walsh. Now tell me, in your proposal for the Mountain View Defense Initiative, how did you account for asymmetric threats in a mountainous terrain environment with limited technological infrastructure? His face went pale. We focused on conventional force multiplication through advanced equipment deployment. Which means you ignored asymmetric threats entirely. You designed a response to the war you wanted to fight, not the war you were likely to face. Through the conference call speaker, Colonel Martinez's voice cut through the room. General Rodriguez, for the record, that's exactly why Fort Carson rejected Hartwell's proposal. Their strategic assessment was 20 years out of date. The devastation on Trevor's face was complete. His career-making presentation had just been demolished by actual military experts, and everyone in the room heard it happen. But something interesting started occurring as the evaluation continued. Rather than doubling down on defensiveness, some of the executives began showing what appeared to be genuine recognition of their failures. Diane raised her hand. General Rodriguez, ma'am, I need to ask you something directly. During the quarterly strategy meetings where we discuss contract bids, did you know we were making mistakes? Did you see problems that we were missing? I studied her face carefully. The corporate arrogance was gone, replaced with something that looked like actual humility.
Every single meeting, Miss Kellerman, every single proposal, you were consistently missing fundamental strategic requirements because you were approaching military contracts as business problems rather than security challenges. Why didn't you say something? The question came out quietly, almost whispered. Miss Kellerman, on 17 different occasions over 3 years, I attempted to contribute to strategic discussions. Each time, I was either ignored, dismissed, or told that my input wasn't needed because I was just cleaning staff. The room went silent again, but this silence felt different. Instead of panic, it carried the weight of recognition. Sarah Pembroke spoke next, her voice shaking slightly. General Rodriguez, ma'am, I reviewed your employment file during the break. The emergency contact you listed? It's a Pentagon phone number, isn't it? Yes. And the address you gave for previous employment? That's Fort Meade. Correct. We never called those references. We never verified anything beyond basic background checks because we assumed... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Because you assumed that someone applying for janitorial work couldn't possibly have significant professional credentials. You assumed that immigrants and working-class women don't have advanced degrees, military experience, or security clearances. Jake Thornfield, who had been silent for nearly an hour, finally spoke. General Rodriguez, ma'am, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. During those 3 years, did you think we were bad people? Or did you think we were just ignorant? The question surprised me with its directness and apparent sincerity. Mr. Thornfield, I think you're people who live in a bubble that allows you to maintain comfortable assumptions about the world. Those assumptions made it easy for you to dismiss potential contributions from anyone who didn't fit your preconceptions about what competence looks like. So, ignorant, he said quietly. Not malicious, but ignorant. Willfully ignorant, I corrected. There's a difference. Malicious people actively try to harm others. Willfully ignorant people create systems that harm others through deliberate inattention. Rachel Montgomery, the junior analyst who had made jokes about the help, raised her hand with obvious reluctance. General Rodriguez, ma'am, I said some things. Over the past 3 years, I made comments that I'm realizing now that they were incredibly disrespectful. I don't know how to apologize for that. Ms. Montgomery, what specifically are you apologizing for? For treating you like you were invisible? For assuming you couldn't understand complex conversations? For making jokes about the cleaning staff that were really jokes about people I saw as beneath me? Her voice cracked on the last words. And what do you understand now that you didn't understand before? That competence and intelligence exist in people regardless of their job titles, that I was so focused on credentials and positions that I couldn't see the person right in front of me. Through the phone speaker, General Hawkins' voice came through. Carmen, how would you assess the current level of recognition among the staff? I looked around the room, studying faces that had spent 3 years looking through me and were now focused on me with laser intensity. General Hawkins, I'm observing what appears to be genuine recognition of systemic failures in organizational culture. However, recognition and change are 2 different things. Diane stood up slowly. General Rodriguez, ma'am, what would change look like? If we could somehow move forward from this evaluation, what would demonstrate that we had actually learned something? Miss Kellerman, that's an interesting question, but it assumes that moving forward is possible. It assumes that 3 years of systematic disrespect can be corrected through policy changes and good intentions. The hope that had been building in her face disappeared. However, since you asked, I'll tell you what real change would require. It would require acknowledging that your hiring and promotion practices are fundamentally flawed. It would require recognizing that talent exists at every level of your organization and creating systems to identify and develop that talent. Most importantly, it would require understanding that respect isn't something you show to people because of their credentials. It's something you show to people because they're human beings deserving of dignity. Sarah raised her hand again. General Rodriguez, ma'am, if we committed to making those changes, if we restructured our entire approach to employee development and strategic planning, would that influence your recommendation to the Pentagon? Ms. Pembroke, that would depend on whether those changes were genuine or whether they were simply damage control designed to preserve Pentagon contracts. How would you tell the difference? I smiled, not the predatory smile I'd used earlier, but something that might have contained a hint of possibility. Simple. Real change would mean that if I walked back into this building tomorrow as a janitor with no one knowing my background, I would be treated with the same respect and attention that you're showing me right now. The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than panicked. Finally, Jake spoke. General Rodriguez, ma'am, would you be willing to tell us specifically what we did wrong? Not just generally, but specifically so we understand exactly what we need to change? I looked at him for a long moment, evaluating whether this was genuine curiosity or another manipulation attempt. Mr. Thornfield, that's a fair question. And since this is an official Pentagon evaluation, I'll provide you with a detailed breakdown of organizational failures. But first, I want to know something from each of you. I want each person in this room to tell me one specific thing you did or said that you now recognize was disrespectful to me personally. Not generalities about corporate culture, specific actions that you took. The request hung in the air like a challenge. And then, I continued, I want you to tell me what you're going to do differently, not just with me, but with every employee in this building, to ensure that respect isn't conditional on credentials. One by one, hands began to rise around the room. The reckoning was about to become very personal. One by one they spoke. Diane went first, her voice steady but quiet. I left you post-it notes with instructions on how to perform basic tasks, as if you were incapable of figuring out cleaning procedures on your own. I spoke to you like you were a child. I'm going to stop assuming that job titles indicate intelligence levels. Jake followed. I asked you to bring me cookies from the break room like you were a waitress, rather than an employee with dignity. I treated you as personal service staff rather than as a professional. I'm going to ask employees about their background and interests, regardless of their current position. Sarah's confession was longer. I discussed terminating you and other older employees for being too expensive while you were standing right there. I assumed you either couldn't understand or wouldn't matter, even if you did. I'm going to remember that every employee is a complete person with feelings, intelligence, and value. Trevor's voice cracked as he spoke. I called cleaning staff unimportant people and said important people work in the offices. I treated you as invisible furniture. I'm going to recognize that every person in this building contributes to our success and deserves recognition. As each person spoke, I took notes in my evaluation file. Not just their words, but my assessment of their sincerity, their understanding, their likelihood of actual change. Rachel Montgomery was crying when her turn came. I made jokes about the help and laughed about language barriers that didn't exist. I used my position to make myself feel superior to people I saw as beneath me. I'm going to examine my own biases and stop deriving self-worth from putting others down. When the confessions ended, the room fell silent. 37 people had just publicly acknowledged specific acts of disrespect towards someone they now knew was one of the most qualified military professionals they would ever encounter. I closed my evaluation file and looked around the room one final time. General Hawkins, I'm ready to present my preliminary findings. Proceed, General Rodriguez. I stood, moving to the center of the room where everyone could see me clearly. Based on 3 years of direct observation and today's formal evaluation, I find that Hartwell Defense Systems demonstrates fundamental organizational failures that render it unsuitable for Pentagon contracts requiring advanced strategic thinking, cultural competency, or adaptive leadership. The silence was absolute. However, I continued, I also find evidence of capacity for recognition and potential for change among individual staff members. I could see hope flickering in their faces. Therefore, my recommendation to Pentagon procurement oversight is as follows. Hartwell Defense Systems will be placed on suspended contractor status for a period of 18 months. During that time, they will implement comprehensive organizational reforms under Pentagon monitoring. Diane's breath came out in a rush of relief. Those reforms will include mandatory bias training for all personnel, implementation of talent identification programs for employees at all levels, restructuring of promotion and evaluation processes to identify underutilized capabilities, and quarterly assessments conducted by Pentagon oversight to measure actual cultural change. I pulled out an official Pentagon document that I'd prepared during the break. If, after 18 months, Hartwell demonstrates genuine transformation in organizational culture and strategic competence, contractor status will be restored. If not, all Pentagon relationships will be permanently severed. Jake raised his hand. General Rodriguez, ma'am, who will conduct the oversight assessments? I smiled. A real smile this time, not the predatory expression I'd used earlier. That will be determined by Pentagon personnel decisions, Mr. Thornfield, though I suspect they'll want someone with extensive experience in organizational assessment and strategic evaluation. Through the phone, General Hawkins spoke. Carmen, will you be available for ongoing consultation on this matter? If Pentagon oversight determines that my expertise would be valuable in monitoring Hartwell's transformation, I would be willing to consider that assignment. The implications hit the room like a physical force. I would potentially be returning, not as a janitor, but as their Pentagon-appointed evaluator. Sarah raised her hand tentatively. General Rodriguez, ma'am, if you do return in that capacity,
how will we know if we're meeting your expectations? Miss Pembroke, my expectations are very simple. Treat every employee with dignity. Value intelligence and competence wherever you find it. And remember that assumptions about people's capabilities based on their appearance, accent, or current job title are not just wrong, they're strategically dangerous. I gathered my materials and prepared to leave. General Rodriguez, ma'am, I have one final question.
I turned back. Why did you do this? Why did you spend 3 years in a position so far below your qualifications? What were you trying to prove? The question deserved a thoughtful answer. Miss Kellerman, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to understand something. I wanted to see how private defense contractors operate when they think no one important is watching. I wanted to understand whether the military-industrial complex actually serves military interests, or whether it's just business people making money off national security. I paused, looking around the room one more time. What I discovered is that competence exists everywhere, but recognition of competence is much rarer. That talent is abundant, but systems for identifying and developing talent are broken. That respect should be universal, but instead it's treated like a reward for meeting arbitrary criteria. I moved back to the center of the room. Most importantly, I learned that some of the most important intelligence about an organization can only be gathered by becoming invisible within it. For 3 years, I had access to conversations, decisions, and behaviors that no external evaluator would ever see. Trevor raised his hand. General Rodriguez, ma'am, was this entire assignment planned? Were you sent here specifically to evaluate us? I shook my head. Mr. Walsh, this was my own initiative. I wanted to understand the defense industry from the ground up. The Pentagon evaluation was supposed to be a routine contractor assessment. What it became was the most comprehensive organizational study I've ever conducted. Through the phone, Colonel Martinez spoke. General Rodriguez, for the record, this evaluation methodology should be considered for broader implementation across Pentagon contractor oversight. That will be included in my final report, Colonel Martinez. I walked to the door, then turned back one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, you have 18 months to prove that today's recognition can become lasting change. The Pentagon will be watching. More importantly, every employee in this building will be watching to see if your promises translate into different behavior. I opened the door, then paused. And remember, the next person who empties your trash cans or cleans your offices might be exactly who they appear to be, or they might be someone whose capabilities you can't imagine. The question is, will you be able to tell the difference? I walked out of conference room A, past the same hallways where I'd pushed a cleaning cart for 3 years, through the lobby where I'd been invisible, and into the Colorado sunshine. In my car, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. 3 years of observation, analysis, and strategic planning had culminated in the most satisfying evaluation I'd ever conducted. My phone rang. General Hawkins. Carmen, that was the most extraordinary contractor assessment in Pentagon history. The recording of that evaluation is going to be studied in military leadership courses for decades. Thank you, ma'am. It was an honor to serve. Carmen, I have to ask, do you really think they can change? I started my car and pulled out of the Hartwell parking lot, watching the building shrink in my rearview mirror. Patricia, I think some of them want to change. Whether they can sustain that desire when the immediate crisis passes, that remains to be seen. And if they can't? I smiled, thinking about all the defense contractors who would love to hire a Pentagon general with 3 years of inside knowledge about their primary competitor's weaknesses. Then they'll discover that invisible people see everything,
remember everything, and eventually speak everything.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.